Before I start this video, I want to share a puzzle with you that, although a failure in itself, kind of inspired this design. This is a couple of fused megaminxes that I connected together by the corner in an attempt to daisy chain a whole bunch of them together. I had this really cool idea of sticking a lot of them together and then kind of turning it into a cylinder of some kind, but the project never took off because I couldn't get the puzzles to turn. I don't think this is impossible to make, I just need some further refinement to figure out how to get this design to work properly. But it did give me an idea for a different kind of puzzle that I could build out of 3x3s instead of megaminxes. And I found some inspiration from a rather unusual source: woodworking. Now, I know I've said this before, but I'm a maker at heart, and truth be told, if I wasn't building things out of Rubik's Cubes, I would just be a general maker channel. But I really love modding Rubik's Cubes, and that's just my thing, but I like to find inspiration wherever I can to help influence my designs. One of my favorite YouTube channels is Kyle Toth, and one of my favorite videos he made is the Segmented Torus. In fact, it's one of my all-time favorite maker videos in general. I absolutely love wood-turning channels despite having absolutely no woodworking capabilities myself, and this particular design just really spoke to me, and it was something that I wanted to try and build myself. But of course, I'm not going to build it out of wood, I'm going to try and build a torus out of Rubik's Cubes. And if that sounds weird to you, welcome to the channel. You clearly must be new here.
Ladies, gentlemen, and none of the above, welcome to the Crucible of Cubes. So my plan for this project draws on my continuous obsession with fused cube modifications, this being the largest that I've ever made. Now, a fused cube, for those of you that don't know, is just when you take the cores of two 3x3s... My light just died, brilliant. Now, the fused cube, for those of you that don't know, is when you take two Rubik's Cubes and you join their cores together and you end up with three faces of functionality on one side and three faces of functionality on the other side. The reason that that's a cool puzzle is because the two sides don't interact with one another, and so you end up having two separate puzzles that are kind of joined. Now, the problem with the fused cube is that's pretty much it. You can't join three together because the middle one ends up being locked. I've done it before, it doesn't work, and I tried to explore a 4-cube variant that I ended up succeeding with, and that's the basis for this video. That build, which was the extra long hexagonal prism, was more of a proof of concept than it was an actual puzzle. I pretty much just built a puzzle out of my experiment. So what I want to do now is take all of the stuff that I learned from that puzzle and apply it to this design.
Now, when I built that extra large hexagonal prism, I was only really focused on trying to join the two fused cube parts together. I wasn't really focusing on where I could take this design. But as I was just generally screwing around with the puzzle and trying to get some nice B-roll, I ended up with this pattern here, which was kind of interesting. The curve could easily be extended upon, and I figured if I used like 10 Rubik's Cubes, I could probably get it to curve back around on itself. And that was the basis for how this build was going to work. Although it has to be said that all of these cubes are partially turned, which means that they can't turn on any other axis, and I don't know if joining them all together in the way that I have planned is going to allow for any movement at all. I'm pretty much just flying blind here, but my figuring is that either way I'm going to end up with something pretty cool.
This is my job, by the way.
After I'd finished the arduous task of disassembling everything, I fused all of the cores together in sets of 2, making sure to keep all of the centerpieces aligned properly. And then I put some of the center caps back in just to make sure that all of the pieces were level on either side. This is actually a pretty important step, and I'm surprised that I've never mentioned it before. And after all of that was done, I mixed up a small amount of epoxy sculpt and I pressed it between the gaps of each of the pieces. This was just to smooth everything out and make it look nice. After the epoxy sculpt had set, I took all of the cores over to my belt sander and I started sanding down all of the high points. I was only trying to remove the bulk of the material here since I was going to sand them down by hand later. After I'd finished sanding one of the cores, you can see what it looks like next to one that I hadn't started sanding yet. I sanded all the cores down with a nail file and some Scotch-Brite, and after they were all sanded, I reassembled each of the cubes. As I'm reassembling this first fuse cube, I should probably point out the 3x3 of choice that I use for all of my builds is the Cheese Sail. It's a fantastic 3x3 that has a lot of really great qualities about it, and unfortunately Chi doesn't produce this particular model anymore. But the reason that I like using this puzzle is because it has very rounded off centerpieces. All I have to do is just stick two cores together and then I can get all the faces to turn just fine, although if you use a Rubik's Cube that has very squared off centerpieces, you'll have to sand those areas down. This just ends up saving me some time in the long run. Although I should probably point out that a lot of that time saved was negated by the sheer scale of this project. This took a really long time. One of the really cool things about assembling this many fuse cubes at once is I end up with a load of excess pieces that I can hold on for later. I have a pretty big box of these, as you can see. After a quick trip to my local art store, I came back with some small pieces of balsa wood which I was going to use to align the corner pieces as I glued them together. The last time I joined two corners together, things were a little off because I was doing it all by eye, so I needed a bunch of known right angles, that way I could make sure the corner pieces were aligned perfectly. Plus, since I was doing 5 of them, I needed to make my life a little easier. After I'd finished gluing all of the corners together, I wrapped some epoxy sculpt around each of the pieces and I waited for it to harden.
As you can see, I've moved the shop around a little. I think it looks better this way.
It was only after I started sanding all of the high points down that I realized just how well the corners were aligned together, and I'm definitely going to use this balsa wood technique in the future. In fact, I have a lot of new projects planned with it. After I finished sanding everything, I got a nail file out and I rounded over all of the sharp edges and I sanded the faces some more just to make sure that they were aligned perfectly. And then it was time to reassemble everything and start figuring out how I was going to turn this into a torus. This was one of the segments that I was going to be using for this build. It consists of an extended corner and a fuse cube. I began assembling the puzzle and slowly daisy chaining all of these segments together, and after I had a couple joined, this is what it looked like.
Does anybody else think that I've gotten a little carried away here? Or is it just me? Alright, so I have joined all 5 of the fuse cubes together, and I have joined them to all 5 of the corner pieces. Now what I have to do is I have to get this corner piece here to connect to this corner piece here, and once I have it all connected, I then have to figure out how to get it to turn whilst it's still connected. If I can't get the pieces to turn, this whole build will be a failure. I think this looks pretty cool. Something seems to be wrong here. I'm going to need another set of fuse cubes and another corner. I know. I should have known that I would need 12. Seeing as how it's a multiple of 6, maths was never my strong suit. Okay, so I have everything reassembled, and this is what it looks like. Pretty cool, huh? Some people have said it looks like a Christmas wreath. If I had done this a couple months later, maybe it would be a more seasonal item, but for now, I'm pretty happy with how this looks. I just have to figure out how I'm going to go from this to a torus. Now, the actual shaping of a torus isn't that bad. I have a few things to learn, but I'm pretty sure I can get it done. The problem is, how do I extend the pieces without constricting any movement, or at least enough movement being available that it still works as a puzzle? I have these faces half turned just to kind of lock everything in place, But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to loosen it all. I'm going to play around with some of the movement, and I'm going to make sure that it actually does scramble. I'm not going to scramble it, I just want to make sure that that is an option. Remember, these are puzzles and they do have to work, even if they end up sitting on a shelf for the majority of their lives.
6.5 hours later.
Okay, in my curiosity, I have well and truly scrambled this, and I can't get it back to the way I had it. So, I might as well show you that I've got some very interesting movement here. It is a little elastic, which I don't want it to be, and that's kind of because I don't know how to hold it properly, and I also don't know what kind of moves are available to me. I think I might have just gotten it back, actually. This is really hard to use. But yeah, you can see that I've got it almost back to the way I had it. And it's really cool because you have to do 2 sets of moves at a time, which I am finding very difficult to demonstrate without breaking it. That turns there, and then if I get that one to turn there, I can get it to move around. So very interesting movement. I'm gonna have to disassemble this just to get it back into the shape that it originally was in, and once I get it back into the shape that it was in, I'm going to glue all of the pieces down, not just tighten them, I'm going to glue them down to make sure that I don't get any more of this chaotic mess happening, and then I have to move into the shaping. What have I gotten myself into?
I decided to keep some of the layers partially turned since they prevented the puzzle from turning, and I wanted to keep it that way. But I couldn't fit the puzzle on my bandsaw, so I had to sand everything down on my belt sander.
Okay, so here is what I have now. I've cut these areas flat, the same goes on the other side, and I've also cut some areas off here to kind of, very similarly to a hexagonal prism, kind of try and line up these planes here. Now, as I was cutting this, I've come to a realization that I don't want to do the torus anymore. The reason that I don't want to is because this area here, which needs to be here, has to kind of be cut away in order to get it into that torus shape. And if I want to get that shape, I have to extend everything out, which means I have to kind of undo everything that I've cut off here. So I've kind of changed up the design a little bit. What I want to do is I want to complete the flat faces here, here, all the way around all 6 sides, but I want to leave all of this beautiful chaotic weirdness inside here, and I want to really show the nature of all of the cubes, but I also want to kind of encapsulate it in some crazy weird faceted nonsense or something that I can do. I don't know, I don't even know what I'm thinking about right now. All I know is it's going to look really, really cool, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by clearing out all of the flashing and all the melted plastic inside each of the pieces, and then I'm going to stuff them full of epoxy sculpt. I'm going to sand all of those down to get them flat, and then I'm going to start extending everything. But first things first, let's start cleaning up all of these pieces.
I went around the puzzle and I cut off as much plastic as I could. This is a pretty important step because if I don't do it, then I end up getting a load of cavities and holes in the pieces as I try and fill them. And after I'd finished cutting all the plastic off, I mixed up some epoxy sculpt and I began to fill each of the pieces. After all the epoxy sculpt had hardened, I started looking over the puzzle and tried to figure out where all of the extensions were going to be. This wasn't like any other puzzle. I had to pay very close attention to where the extensions were because if I didn't make everything symmetrical, I might end up constricting movement, and that kind of ruins the entire purpose of this puzzle. After I had a pretty rough idea of where all the extensions were going to be, I started peeling off all of the stickers and preparing the surface of each of the pieces to get them ready to be extended. And now with all the stickers off, this is what the puzzle looks like, and you can really start to see what looks like a hexagonal shape. Although I had pretty much decided at this point in the build that I was going to go for a hexagon, I wasn't totally sold on that shape. So I took the puzzle over to my belt sander and I sanded all of the outside faces down, and then I could better see where all of the extensions were going to be. It did become apparent to me while I was sanding that I wasn't going to be able to sand the top and bottom faces down since they were way too wide to fit on the narrow belt of my belt sander. So I was going to have to come up with another way to sand those down, but I would deal with that much later on in this build.
So because I'm just winging all of these extensions here, I don't actually have a whole lot of reference points to figure out where the extensions need to go while the puzzle's disassembled, and that's kind of a problem because I need that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pile on some very thin extensions while the puzzle is assembled here. I'm going to wait for all of that to cure, take it over to the belt sander, sand everything down to the dimension that I'm happy with, and then I'm going to disassemble it so I now have my reference points for each of the extensions. I don't really know if it's going to work, but I have done it before and it has proved to be very useful, so I think that's the best way to go with this design. It does involve removing all of the sticker residue from each of the pieces though, but that was always going to be a problem I had to deal with.
To get rid of all the sticker residue, I just rubbed it off with my thumb, and after that unbearable task was complete, I got a blade out and I started scratching into each of the pieces that were going to be extended. All this does is help the epoxy sculpt bite into each of the pieces, and it's not really the most necessary step, but it's one that I like to do anyway.
Now, I know what you're thinking. This looks pretty Joseph Merrick, but the idea behind this is that the extensions kind of stick out of all of the planes that I'm going to be sanding on, so when I sand them back, I'll be cutting off parts of the extensions, and that will allow me to use each of these little cores as reference points. And for all of the ones that I don't end up sanding down, that just means that I have to pile a little more on there. And because it's hard to kind of make extensions like this, you can see how easy it is to move them around, I kind of need this core part to harden so that I can build it up a little further. And the more that I build out and the more times that I do this, I end up being able to slowly build out a very sturdy extension without ever losing track of where it is that I am. I think I need to do the majority of the extensions this way before I disassemble anything.
After I'd finished building up all of the extensions and everything had hardened, things were looking a little weird, but that's what I was expecting. But now that I had all of the extensions done, or partial extensions in this case, it was time to sand everything down and get this puzzle back into the hexagonal shape. And after a couple of the faces were sanded, you can really see where the extensions get flat spots and how that compares to some of the faces that I hadn't sanded yet. Although a few of the extensions were lost, the majority of them held on just fine, and after a couple rounds of sanding and a few repairs off camera, I was ready to disassemble everything so I could start extending all of the pieces properly.
It's working! That looks cool. We're finally starting to get somewhere.
Once everything was taken apart, I split all of the pieces into those that I wouldn't have to do any further work on, and all of the ones that I was going to have to repair, which was pretty much all of them. I broke out the epoxy sculpt and mixed up what I thought would be enough for all of the pieces, but it ended up not even touching the pile. I ended up needing a lot of epoxy sculpt for this build, and I'd already gone through a 4-pound tub at this point. I built up and repaired each of the pieces one by one, and I set them aside to harden. And after everything is solidified, I took all of the pieces over to my belt sander and I sanded them all down.
That's it! I've been sanding for hours! God damn it, there are so many pieces.
I returned the following day with a newfound respect for just how big this project was, and I sanded the rest of the pieces down. After I had finished sanding everything, it was now time to reassemble the puzzle, and that was a lot easier said than done. But before I could reassemble anything, I had to round over all of the pieces to make sure that they would fit together properly. I wasn't finishing the pieces up, I was just trying to make them a little smoother.
I have assembled a segment here, and this contains a fuse cube part as well as two corner pieces, some of the big corners here. And you can see, if I show you, the beginnings of one face, another, and that 60-degree angle. And you can also see kind of, I suppose this is the bottom and this is the top surface. And it's kind of starting to come together. And now all I have to do is build this all the way around. And all of these areas on the inside, which aren't very interesting, are going to get stickered up as kind of like a regular Rubik's Cube load of stickers. And then the outside is going to be kind of some colorful mess or something like that. I think it's going to be really cool to see kind of the cubic parts on the inside. I don't really know how this is going to look even now still as I'm building it, but for now I've got all the extensions done and it's just a case of reassembling everything. See, even though the extensions are where they need to be, some of the repairs stick out. And as a result, I have to carve bits away.
Because I was trying to put together a puzzle that had a load of unique pieces and I didn't have any references, I reassembled a small segment of the puzzle and then I copied that as best as I could and used it as a guide to reassemble everything else.
That bit is that bit. That bit is that bit. This bit is that bit. And this bit is that bit. And that means that this bit is that bit. Yeah, we're getting somewhere. No, that's the wrong bit. Ha! Wait. This has been the last hour of my life.
It might seem a little inefficient to have to sift through a giant pile of puzzle pieces just to find the one that I need, and you're right, but eventually, and with much difficulty, I started to get everything back together. Although bridging the gap between the segments was a little complicated at first.
God, this is like trying to tape smoke together. Ta-da! It's complete. Well, for the most part, at least. So now I have everything assembled, and I've even got the centerpieces of some of the cubes put in as well. So now everything's ready to be sanded. It's just a case of taking it over to the belt sander now and trying to get these faces not only to be flat, but also to be as uniform as possible. Because once I disassemble this again, I'm going to have a load of pieces which should be the same size, but in my experience, that's not always the case. So for now, I'm going to take this over to my belt sander and start sanding down all of these outer faces.
Because there was so much epoxy sculpt in this build, it was very heavy and kinda hard to hold, but I still managed to sand the outside faces without too much trouble. The top and bottom faces, on the other hand, were a different story, and I was gonna have to come up with a solution to sand those pieces down. I figured the best way to go about sanding the top and bottom faces was to break the puzzle into 3 segments, like I have here. The reason that would work is because each one of those segments was narrow enough to fit on the belt sander lengthwise, and I was able to sand the entire top and bottom surface in one go. For as long as I was paying attention to the surface patterns of each of the segments, with any luck, as I was sanding them, I would be able to make all 3 of them uniform. But I didn't have that luck.
As though I've broken through on this piece here, as you can see. I've got one sticking out on this side, but on this side it's broken off because I sanded down just a little too far. But see, here's the thing, I actually didn't sand down too far. This shouldn't have been as small as it was, and that leads me to believe that this piece was rotated because I lined up this ridge with this ridge, but this ridge wasn't centered because of the mismatch of the pieces. This is all very complicated stuff. What has taken a few minutes in this video has been about a week of sanding for me. I've taken the puzzle apart, I've put it back together again, I've taken it apart, I've put it back together again. I've sanded it while it's assembled, while it's disassembled, and while it's in segments and everything else in between. And now that I've joined all of the segments together, I can still see some subtle mismatches between the pieces, and I really don't think that any more sanding on the build sander is going to get this shape to be any better. The subtle squishy mismatches between the pieces have caused a lot of small errors that have compounded on themselves, and I think if I keep this in one big unit and I keep sanding it this way, I'm never going to get it done. In fact, I risk damaging things any more than I already have. You can see I'm missing these pieces now because I sand a little too far. So what I'm going to do now is something a little unorthodox, and I've never actually done it successfully before. What I'm going to do is I'm going to disassemble the puzzle. I'm going to take everything apart, I'm going to match all of the pieces up that are identical to one another, and then I'm going to try and sand down the ones that are too big and build up the ones that are too small to find a kind of equilibrium between them. And slowly as I reassemble the puzzle, if there are any subtle mismatches between the pieces, I'll just repair them as I go along. I think that this is the best way to get this shape to work, and it's also the only way that it's going to work without me losing my sanity. So, time to start disassembling. Because I used some super glue to glue all these pieces together, I now have to go through and break them all apart. It's not that much of a problem, they're very lightly held together. But every now and then you get a couple that are joined together that you just have to pull apart.
I got a nail file and some Scotch-Brite out, and I just started going over all of the pieces and finishing them up one by one. Whenever I encountered a piece that was too big or too small, I would repair it with some epoxy sculpt or sand it down, and it took me about a week to finally reassemble the puzzle. As I was reassembling everything, I was cutting all of the stickers out for each of the pieces as I went along, so pretty much the entire ending process of this build was all encapsulated in one big step. And after I had finally cut all of the stickers out and finished reassembling everything, here it is, the puzzle is finally done. Building this puzzle was one of those off-camera roller coasters that just doesn't do the final video justice, and there was a lot of problem solving that I had to deal with to try and get this puzzle to work. Although that being said, I'm very happy to see that it finally did come together, and I think the overall result is fantastic. There are a couple problems. For example, as I'm holding it here, you can see the pieces like to shift and move from place to place, and this caused a lot of misalignments that made the initial shaping of the puzzle very hard to do. But I think my reassembly job by taking the puzzle apart and just slowly reassembling it and fixing all of the errors as I went along was the best solution to that problem, and it actually ended up fixing a lot of the misalignment issues that I was having. Now, one question I know everyone is going to be asking me is, can I scramble this puzzle? And the answer is yes, but no, I'm not going to. And that's not really because I don't want to. Believe me, I do want to see what this puzzle looks like scrambled, even if it takes me an age to fix it, but I can't really scramble it because it's very hard to hold, and it's very awkward to hold too.
Oh god, what have I created?
The reason this puzzle is kind of squishy is because all of the cubes that are in it have their own spring mechanisms, and connected together, they all compound on themselves, and so as a result, it's not the most stable design. But I can move a few pieces around here to show you that moves are possible, and I can even get some moves to be done in a way that can show you how it would actually be scrambled, but I'm not going to scramble it. In fact, I actually think that there's enough pieces sticking out that it might end up being a very bandaged puzzle even if I was to get a few turns in. But regardless of that, I didn't build this puzzle to be scrambled, I built it to be looked at, and I think it looks pretty cool nonetheless, and I'm very happy with the inside design. I think that all of the cubes that are kind of jutting out in different positions give this a really unique look, and it's something that I've just never seen before. Now, it has to be said that although I'm really happy with how this puzzle looks, this wasn't the original design that I set out for. I did want to build a torus, and I still do, but the way that I decided to construct this puzzle just didn't take into account how I was going to shape it, and that's more my fault than it was the cubes I was working with. I've already kind of figured out how I'm going to go about building a torus, but that's something that I have to do further on down the track now, so for now I'm going to focus on some smaller builds, including my upcoming 30 Day 30 build series, which is going to be starting on the 1st of December. Well, that was a fun project. I think this puzzle turned out really well, and I'm very happy with the overall scheme. I think that the hexagonal prism scheme on the outside with the white and the yellow looks really nice. I'm gonna leave the inside unstickered for now, because the actual scheme that I want to do on the inside, I don't have enough stickers for. So you'll be seeing this puzzle a little later on, but for now, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Shit. I want to die.